Thank you, Cosmin. Thank you, all the wonderful girls from Parasite. It's really a great pleasure to be in such a well-organized and well-prepared conference. And besides that, it's my first time in Hong Kong, so I really enjoy it. So the purpose of my presentation is to reflect on the role of the museum, especially the European model of the museum, where most of the museums are still public museums, state or city museums, and especially the role of the museum today in time of increasing extreme right-wing positions, xenophobia, and populism. So the problematics that the conference touches, of course. While particularly talking about all this, particularly I try to focus on refugee crisis, migrant crisis, whatever you call it, in Europe. The question I ask is the extent to which it is possible to destabilize the existing national museum model in a way to be able to organize memories differently, not only strengthening the existing identities and their cultural space in a way that includes more than individual national identities and common European values. It is hard to believe that the refugees crisis could change the existing model of national cultural institutions in Europe, of course, but we can consider the gap it would leave behind. Since I come from Slovenia, once the westernmost republic of former Yugoslavia that collapsed, as you know, in the beginning of the 90s, followed by bloody national wars. So a Slovene, of course, this is my point of utterance, I would say. It's very important that we speak from very concrete position. So I begin by pointing out how the authorities in Eastern Europe reacted to the refugee crisis in territories of former socialist countries such as Slovenia, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and so. All these countries have experienced largely bitter experience of isolation, of course, in time of socialism. Nevertheless, today advocate the most restrictive policy towards the refugee issues in Europe. After the Hungarian president, Viktor Orban, was the first to put up the barbed fence on the southern Hungarian border, other countries quickly followed his example, including Slovenia, my country, a measure that practically closed the Balkan refugee route. The Balkan refugee route stretched along the highway that during Yugoslavia time connected the southeast and northwest part of former common country. And the name of that highway was the highway of brotherhood and unity. The name Brotherhood and Unity Highway supported one of the main ideology of the socialist, multi-ethnic and multi-religious country. For many of us living on territory of former Yugoslavia, of course, again, at that time, socialist country, the highway that was largely built by youth work brigades that happened after the Second World War symbolized the important notion of collectivity and solidarity. In socialist Yugoslavia, when all of us had free health insurance, free schools, kindergartens, and where practically every village had a cultural center and the cities had open and working museums, today the situation is significantly different. education, and healthcare need to be paid. Some of the main regional museums are closed or on the verge of extinction, and people are losing their jobs. The Balkan route, therefore, not only symbolizes the loss of homes of refugees, mostly coming from the Middle East or Africa, as you know, but also the loss of our own community, not just former common state, but society at large. Many European museums are at the moment in some way associated with refugees, either by employing them, by making programs understandable to their culture, or by displaying art that is critical to the treatment of refugees in one way or another. Certainly, the efforts of many of these institutions need to be set as an example to encourage others who have done nothing in the area to follow their lead. However, in spite of laudable initiatives, the question remains how to continue, how museums are changing through this commitment to refugees, and whether the refugees are not merely a new topic in the established and slightly updated programs of national institutions whose founding acts and missions remain the same as before the crisis. Along with the fact that refugees are increasingly prevented from traveling to Europe, there is a bitter touch that all of these programs merely strengthened our self-image of moral and cultural Europeans. Our tolerance for different cultures of refugees is often blurred by the fact that refugees are essentially contemporary proletarians, and that they, in this sense, share the fate of many Europeans. In the words of Slovene sociologist and theorist Rastko Močnik, I quote, "Today's refugees are the result of collapse of societies. They are the end of this process, an expression of collapse of all classes and nations. In reality, they are contemporary proletariat. Refugees are the result of the neoliberal project as the world process, and therefore the solutions to this crisis lie in the alliance between unlawful and expropriated people, regardless of religious, ethnic, or any other affiliation." Now I will try to explain what I've been talking with different art projects, starting with the project that I co-curated this summer in Venice together with Charles Esche, and which was commissioned by artistic group Irvin, that consisted one of the most important artistic movement in the 80s in Eastern Europe called Neue Slowenische Kunst. So just after Yugoslavia collapsed and the new state of Slovenia was formed in 91, Neue Slowenische Kunst, or NSK, established an artistic state to react to the new national state, to say we are different, we are not, somehow we have the distance to this, to the old state and to the new state as well. And so they wanted to also to point to the fact how important is to think new transnational alliances. So with the project, we somehow wanted to point to the new situation, of course, in Europe, but also to the general question of the role of the state today. So the NSK state, which was founded in '91, has until now issued passports. So they, at the same time, started issuing passports. So they issued passports to over 15,000 citizens from all over the world, including many artists, intellectuals, but also many people without any connections with the art world, who somehow on the website found the information of the NSK passport, and they simply applied in a wish to establish easier conditions to cross the borders. So we invited the curators. We invited the Kurdish artist Ahmet Ögüt to design the installation, and you can see this is already the first image. So Ahmet Ögüt designed the installation of the pavilion, giving the main focus on weightlessness. So you can see here the desk where we employed the refugees who actually created the migrant policy in the pavilion, and they issued the passports. And then, as the desk was almost like floating, this anti-gravity situation was also emphasized by this floor, slanted floors. And there was also a trampoline that pointed to this anti-gravity, let's say, aesthetic. So we, together with the artists, we wanted, of course, to emphasize the absence of any territorial or any national aspirations of NSK state in time, how this artistic state is called. Just after the NSK state in time was established in '92, in '93, we presented for the first time in the frame of Venice Biennale the NSK pavilion. And at that time, Slavoj Žižek wrote a text in the catalog, and I wanted to quote him briefly. Today, so this is from '93. Today, the concept of utopia has made an about-face turn. Utopian energy is no longer directed towards a stateless community, but towards a state without a nation, a state which would no longer be founded on an ethnic community and its territory, therefore simultaneously towards a state without territory, towards a purely artificial structure of principles and authority, which will have severed the umbilical cords of ethnic origin, indigenousness, and rootedness. Perhaps we could apply Žižek's thoughts to the national institutions as museums. If today we can imagine the possibilities of transnational state, we can concurrently imagine transnational institutions. For example, transnational museums that are not devoted to national narratives, or, as it is today increasingly present in major international museums, as MoMA, as State, name it, to displaying geographical or cultural diversity. And this cultural and geographical diversity actually only repeats this neoliberal pattern of competition between diversities. So this transnational museum in the context of this talk is linked to the histories without clear administrative identities. Today, national museums are still reflecting the symbolic order in their country or in broader communities, such as European community. You know, there are many cultural programs supported by European community, and most of them, they strengthened and they somehow put on the priority list the programs that are linked to the common European identity. So somehow this European identity is replacing the national identities. So they are therefore still in the service of ethnical and cultural citizen as defined by European values and all those who are becoming citizens. In addition, we are interested in where the memories of those who do not conform to the symbolic order, the standardized values of the European community will be recorded. So, of course, the refugees that are coming to Europe or have been coming to Europe do not conform to this symbolic order, any, you know, the national symbolic orders or European Union symbolic order. So in continuation, I will try to reflect even more with two examples, two artistic projects, and I will also mention at the end briefly how the institution that I run sees itself in the current situation. So the first of two projects, art projects that I'm going to talk, is a project conceived by Serbian artist Đorđe Balmazović from 2013 to 2015, who visited various asylum facilities in Serbia, drawing refugee route maps to Europe. His maps are the result of direct work with refugees undertaken in collaboration with the Belgrade group 484 and other artists. His maps do not only document refugee routes, long hours of crossing forests or the sea, but also incorporate their answers to the questions such as why they had undertaken their journey, the hardships they faced, how they crossed borders, how much they paid smugglers, and their experience with the police and the inhabitants of the countries they traveled through. Balmazovic's representations of refugees' journeys are stripped down to the bare facts in order to draw attention to the absence of common and human asylum policy in Europe. His maps transcribes oral testimonies. Oral histories are histories of those in an inferior position with regard to the culture of dominating the written word. These maps serve no counter-histories. Their fragmentary nature is intended to highlight the multiplicity of histories, including the histories of those not entitled to write them down. The maps could be named as the absent histories of people who are losing their homelands, their history, and as a result, their future. The second example relates to the content of the film titled The Train of Shadows by Nika Autor, which opens with a smartphone video clip, a selfie of the stowaway, a refugee hiding in the train chases traveling from Belgrade to Ljubljana. I will show you just a short part of the beginning. and the end of the film. So the film lasts more than an hour, so you will see only the beginning and the end.
Begunca v podvozju vlaka na poti iz Beograda v Ljubljano. Posnetek, narejen s kamero na mobilnem telefonu. So že iznašli zgodovino filma, kamor bi se tak posnetek lahko vpisal. Sploh ima pravico do zgodovine, ki ni njegova lastna.
So this is already the end of the film. Sorry, because of this cut. So between the beginning and the end, there was the whole history. I mean, different parts from different films from the film history with the subject of the train. And this is the refugee camp in Belgrade last January. So the refugee, so you saw that video clip at the beginning of the film. So that refugee hide together with another refugee in the train chases. When they found themselves in Ljubljana, they met the artist Nika Autor, and they gave her that video clip because she was also an activist helping the refugees seriously at that time. So the main question of the film The Train of Shadows is whether such a video clip can have its own history within the history of film. Pursuing the question after the introductory scene of the train chases, many scenes from film history follow that involve trains. The film ends with a documentary footage of devastated railway station in Belgrade, so that's what you've seen just, where the refugees themselves built a makeshift camp in January 2017. They were stranded there in the neighborhood of improvised parking lots, where the workers of Serbian railways who had lost their jobs collect parking fees to make a living. The lives of Serbian railway workers are perhaps better by a fraction than the lives of the refugees facing impossible conditions, where, among other things, they are keeping themselves warm by burning railroad tracks of abandoned lines. The film also connects the refugee crisis with the crisis that followed the collapse of the common industry of the former Yugoslavia. This also includes the collapse of the common railway infrastructure that connected the former Yugoslavian republics at that time. near the refugee center in an area where there was once a busy railway and the location of a number of other companies. Now a new elite they built a new spectacular hub called Belgrade Waterfront, or how Belgrade people call it, Belgrade on water. So it's typical, of course, neoliberal gentrification situation. So this new hub, Belgrade Waterfront, the building of it is co-financed by the capital from United Arab Emirates. Arabs, but also Chinese capital is slowly penetrating the former Yugoslav railway and road infrastructure, its ironworks and thermal power plants, and the rest of the industry. Following China's investments of 500 million euros in the Athens port of Piraeus, China decided to invest 200 million euros in Serbian railway, with the main focus on better connecting Belgrade with the capital of Hungary, Budapest. The reconstruction of the railway route Belgrade-Zagreb-Ljubljana, where our two refugees have traveled, is not planned yet. Although something should be done, because the train ride, which reopened after the Balkan Wars in 1995 with outdated wagons, now lasts 11 hours instead of former 6 hours. Clearly, the Chinese march to Europe is faster over Budapest. So in the light of this story, it makes sense to mention that the Belgrade Museum of Contemporary Art, which holds the largest collection of Yugoslav art, will be reopened for the public this week, actually, after being closed for 10 years. When the Serbian Ministry of Culture announced the reopening to the public, the ministry did not forget to mention that their priority was to open a Serbian culture center in Beijing by the end of this year. It will be interesting to see how the current situation in countries on the outskirts of Europe, which are increasingly losing their sovereignty, while on the other hand strengthening their nationalism, will impact the future of National Museum, whose history will be on display in these museums. It is highly likely that the work of the Serbian artist Đorđe Balmazović of the refugee route maps will one day end up in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade. However, as a part of which history, of which story? The national narrative of parallel history of people who the national narrative or a narrative of parallel history of people who so tragically wound up on Serbian territory. Similarly, we can ask ourselves about the film of Nika Autor, of which Silje Oberstar writes, I quote, "Sometimes videos can have a different history than the situation they are depicting. Although there is nothing film-like about the refugee selfie, it seems that in addition to the political history of the situation, a memory of his film history also belonged to the refugees. The prophecy of memory had to be examined to see whether this could provide him with a better future," end of the quote. which history will therefore include refugee images. In both works of art that I showed, it is necessary to point out the one thing that differentiates them from art, which merely includes the new images of refugees, of course, into existing mental scenes or landscape. In both of our cases, the decision of the artist was possible only because of the trust the refugees had to hand over the memories for safekeeping. We can only imagine the doubts in the refugee's mind when trusting Balmazovic maps, how much they paid their smugglers to get them across the border, how they were treated by the local authorities, the attitude of the local population towards them, etc. It was a moment of trust when two refugees handed over their video to Nika author, and as again Cyril Oberstar wrote, and I quote, "The situation in which the video was handed over based on a fleeting moment of trustfulness, a brief restoration of normalcy in a moment of oblivion of the real circumstances. Therefore, the refugees somewhere on their way gave their memories to the only people they trusted at that moment, the artists. We could say that they treated the artists as the custodians of their memories, of course. How can such a new role of the artist influence the existing model of the National Museum? We can say that such and similar works facilitate in deepening the gap in the museum, the gap between the illusion that there are still national museums and sovereign countries and the real truth of the museum. The real truth of the museum can only reflect the current governance mechanisms, which are increasingly associated with transnational capital hegemonies or hegemonies of the most powerful countries in the world. And now I will just briefly mention how this new situation, or rather new situation in Europe and in the global world in general, that is, manipulated with these transnational flows of capital. So how this is reflected in our museum. So the name of the museum that I run is Moderna Galleria, but the new part of the museum that was established in 2011, that name is Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova. Kozmin already mentioned that I've been working in the frame of two big departments, Museum of Modern and Museum of Contemporary Art, but as a part of the same institution, Moderna Galleria, which was founded in 1948 as a museum devoted primarily to national art. So Museum of Contemporary Art, Metelkova, was built with the help of European Union funds for regional development, which could only be obtained with a very detailed and serious program. However, its realization in the end barely relied about the content program, but almost entirely on deadlines and the rigid financial framework. Our local politicians succumbed to this bureaucratic logic and forgot about the national interest in hiding the collections, about suitable storage facilities, suitable lighting, air conditioning, and so on. And as a result, the administrative logic left behind a great deal of nonsense in the building. Marko Sanchanin, who has been invited by the museum to correct these unnecessary installations, is now pointing out this absurd equipment and unclear functions of certain rooms with his art interventions. Sanchez, who described, just to show, I'm ending slowly, oh, sorry, oops. Okay, so, something is missing. Okay. So the Sanchez, who describes his approach as institutional care, is rethinking these spaces where the real truth of building is hiding. So here you can see just his drawing where he describes the crypt that he found in these unlogical spaces as the locations of the real truth. If we would follow Lacan, we would say only real. The truth is related to the fact that in time when there is no real sense of national cultures, and when transnational mechanisms control us, we are in a situation we cannot classify in the existing symbolic order. The institution whose mission is normally defined within the existing symbolic order is therefore developing its own crypt content in these gaps. In this, its greatest allies are in fact the artists, and I mentioned the refugees before, and we can add to this group of allies also the curators, the intellectuals, the new cognitariat and proletariat. The possibility for reinterpretation of the role of the museum lies in the gaps between institutionalized and non-institutionalized contents of the museum. The new contents of the museum, as well as the new contents of previously described works of art, are not manifestative, but are created as performative gestures of refugees and artists and the institution. This trust is not protected by any formal agreement. It is not a relationship that will be protected forever, but an expression of some sort of temporary configuration. So these temporary allies between artists, refugees, proletariat, and so on. The institution, which is ready for such temporary configurations, has found its hidden sense, a hidden space of its deinstitutionalization. It seems that it is possible to face new forms of hegemony from a gap in the institution. Deinstitutionalization would thus mean a space within the institution itself, where non-institutional or not yet institutionalized content can seek protection, without at the same time becoming the manifestative content of the museum. Thank you.